Hello, can everyone hear me okay? Right, so my name's Alex Speller, and I've come to talk to you today about the common pitfalls in Ember.js. So I've spent a lot of time on IRC and sometimes on the discourse forums helping people with their Ember problems, and I've been making notes of the common patterns that have happened. So just out of interest, could I get like a hands up? Have I helped any of you on IRC? So yeah, quite a few. That's cool. So some of you might even have your problems in this talk. I'm going to have to go really quickly because I had about 100 or 150 slides I wanted to prepare, and I've had to cut it down ruthlessly, and there are still loads. So this is going to be really quick. So starting off, routing. So one thing that's, that people hit a lot is the definition of resource versus root. There actually used to be quite a big difference in less than 1.7 because roots couldn't have subroots, but now they can. So the only difference is the namespace inheritance, which is the example at the bottom. Post with a subroot comment is post comment root. Post with a sub-resource comment is just comment root. And the guideline is a root should be a verb and a resource should be a noun. It doesn't really matter that much, but that was kind of the original intent. When you're building Ember apps, there's two phases. The router goes through two phases, a validation phase and a setup phase. First, all of the before model, model, and after model hooks are called in order. Then, once all of those have completed all your active roots, then it goes back to the top parent root and runs all of the activate, setup controller, and render template hooks. And calling transition.abort or this.transition2 whilst you're in the validation phase, cancel the transition completely, and it doesn't affect any controller state. So you shouldn't do anything that affects controller state in the validation phase because that will lead to problems. By the way, I am going to be tweeting after this with all these slides, so I'm going to go through very quickly, but you will be able to go back and look at them. Root nesting is always a big problem. Root nesting should generally always be the same as template nesting. If you don't want your templates to be nested, don't nest your roots and give the path argument to the resource or root definition, and that lets you have nested URLs without having nested roots. Automatic index roots are generated when you use resources. So this resource post with the subroot of comments actually generates 3 roots. There's an invisible index root there, and that sometimes throws people. And another thing that throws people with index roots is they're not just for collections. You may, restfully index, you would have a list on it that, it would be for a collection of objects, usually if you used something maybe like Rails or a similar kind of MVC framework. But in this example, you've got a post index root that has the post on it. And you can see the example at the bottom. Post.hbs just has an outlet in it. And in fact, if you don't use post at all, then you will actually get that empty template with the outlet in it automatically. And the actual post is displayed on the index root, and the comments is displayed on a root that is a sibling of the index root. And this is a way to kind of have that nested URL structure without showing posts and comments at the same time. If you basically have nothing on the post root, but you use the index instead, then you can use the model in the parent root without having the template showing at the same time, if that's not what you want. The model hook is not always called, and the roots are it's sometimes quite complex to figure out when it is called or not. There's very recently better documentation about this in the router API docs. But basically, the model hook is always called if you give a integer or a string to transition to. If you give an object to transition to, the model hook is not called and it's skipped. And yeah, so in the second case, this also applies to link to helpers in templates. You can transition to a root without providing all parameters. So in this case, if you declared a root posts with a dynamic segment in, if you just call transition to post without any further arguments, or same with link to helper, it will use the current model if it's there already. You have to be careful with this. You shouldn't do this from unless you're sure that that root already has a current model. But sometimes you can be sure, i.e. if you're in a child root. Roots and controllers do not necessarily have a one-to-one relationship. So here's an example of a dashboard root where you're actually setting 3 controllers and none of them are dashboard controller. This is like perfectly legit. You can do this. I mean, I know that someone, certainly I've heard from Eric Bryn, who's here, I believe, that he hates controller 4, but it's a really useful pattern sometimes. Use it judiciously. When you use link to or in the view and you give a model to it, and it's got for a root with a dynamic segment, serialize will be called on that root. Normally, if you're using Ember Data, then it just uses the default serialize hook, so you don't know about this. But if you're using a dynamic segment that doesn't have _ID at the end, you will need to define the serialize hook, because otherwise you will get undefined in your URLs. Now, all of this stuff about routing, we actually had a hackathon yesterday. I'm going to be presenting this in full tomorrow and giving a quick demo, but I actually deployed it last night, and this gives you a kind of some insight into the roots, and you can see some of this stuff spelled out for you. So that might be quite helpful to show some of this stuff that I've been talking about with routing. Right, next topic, actions. Actions bubble to all active roots. So actions first hit the controller of the template that they are in, and then to the active child root, up to the next parent root, and finally up to application root. They do not bubble through controllers. So if you want actions to bubble, your action should be on your roots. Pre-compilation. I'm sure everyone here probably knows this, but this trips up pretty much everyone. So often people ask the question, do I really need one index.html file that has all of my templates in it? You need a build pipeline. And my advice now is always just go and use Ember CLI. Like, it's great. Bind attribute, bind has special behavior for class. So this does not do the same thing as if you changed class there to be, I don't know, ID or something. This has a very special syntax. However, if you're using link to, it does not work. You have to use class name bindings instead. This is very confusing, and handlebars will fix this. HTML bars will fix most of this when it eventually comes. But until then, this is just a gotcha that you have to kind of memorize. Render, partial, and view are all slightly different. There's not really a quick explanation that I can give apart from go and read this guide. It explains them all differently. Render can't take any arguments, so all of the information, when you use, it can take a single argument of the model, but you can't give further context. So if you need more context with your render helper, you probably need to use a different helper or do something else. Render also has very little to do with the root. It does use if you use render post, it will use the post controller, which is the same post controller that the root uses, but otherwise it doesn't have any relation. So you can render things that don't have roots at all. You can render controllers that don't have any roots, and it will not call any model hooks or any hooks on the root when you use render. The each helper has like a million subtleties to it. Some of them are really useful. There's some really great stuff on this blog post, which goes through all of them. I learned some of this stuff from this blog post. My favorite thing about the each helper is that it has an else block. So you can do each collection, else, sorry, no posts here. That's kind of cool. So moving on to components. Components are intentionally isolated. So I get a lot of people saying, how do I make these components talk to each other? And the answer is you're kind of not supposed to be able to. Like, that's kind of the point. You should be passing in everything you need into components. Communicating between them is hard, but actually sometimes that is a legit thing you want to do. So Matt, who's here and is giving a talk later, actually talked at last year's Emberfest about this very problem. I recommend his going and looking at his talk online if you do really need to make components talk to each other. Send action. This is a constant problem. This is something that every time I explain it, I end up like having to explain it over and over again. The docs are actually really good, but it's just confusing. So like here are like the 8 different things that people try, of which like 2 of them work. Some of them fail silently and some of them blow up. So yeah, basically you call send action, not send. You have to send a string action, and the string has to have been defined on the controller. It's very confusing. The send action docs on component are what you need to look at, and like basically just read them like 6 times. And if you, after reading them, can think of a way to improve them, then do file a pull request, because they do seem to be very hard to understand, but I couldn't figure out a way to actually phrase it any better. So, computed properties. So often people forget the property helper, function.property at the end, and that leads to you outputting a function in the view. It's, that's something that people hit quite a lot. Array dependent keys, like this is really common when you're starting out. You would set a dependent key of some array, and your property then never updates. There are 2 ways to actually make it work. First is to do the dot open square bracket, close square bracket, and that will refire if any element is added or removed from the array. You can also do dot each without any further property on the end, but that's less efficient than just using the square brackets. So if you only care if items are added or removed, use the square brackets. If you want to observe properties on each item, like this property 3 here, it recalculates if any title on any of the property on any of the objects in the array changes, then that's when you use each. Overwriting computed properties. This can lead to some subtle bugs. If you set a computed property like isOn to like a computed property, or you just give a normal property definition, whatever you give to it, and then you call .set on that object and set it to something else, computed property is gone. And that can be really confusing. You can fix this by giving computed property helper that has 3 arguments, which is the attribute name, the value, and the old value. And that way you get setters on your computed properties that won't get overwritten when you call .set. Computed property, Ember.computed documentation goes through it in great detail. Computed properties having the wrong dependencies can lead to really subtle bugs. So here, the property depends on first name and last name, but we're actually getting full name. And although full name probably depends on first name and last name, that's not what you're actually accessing. So you should be very careful to actually make sure the dependencies for your computed property are exactly what you're getting in the property. Observers. There are some issues with observers that are quite subtle. They're not called for unconsumed computed properties. So if you've never called .get on a property or got it in it or put it in a template, observers will never fire. They're also synchronous, whereas a lot of stuff in Ember is async, and that can lead to observers being fired multiple times in a lot of circumstances. The guide is really good. It goes through all these problems in detail, so it's worth checking out. Promises. Errors get swallowed all the time in promises. I think I saw some discussion about this maybe being the default, but I don't think it is still. I think probably the reason for that is that this can cause false positives, because you can then rescue these errors by calling providing a fail handler to your promises. But in development, just do this. It will save you loads of headaches. You can aggregate promises with the RSVP library helpers. So this shows, making one promise out of a load of different promises, and it does the first 2 at the same time. And then after the second one completes, it does a load more promises and aggregates them at the same time with RSVP.all. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but Stefan Penner has a great talk on YouTube here. It's definitely worth checking out. The run loop. So it's really common to forget to use em.run when using the run loop. When using external callbacks. So this is like a jQuery plugin that has a callback. Because it's not Ember aware, you have to make sure to wrap the callback in em.run. In production code, it's inefficient. In your test code, it will actually raise an error. Since relatively recently, I think Ember 1.6, there's a shorter way of doing that, which is shown at the bottom. Ember Data. So Ember Data is really causes a lot of issues. I think it's I'm so glad it's where it is now compared to where it was a year ago when I was last here. It's come on a lot. It's great, but there is still this issue. This issue is a very old issue, and it is the issue that will be solved by single source of truth, which Igor was talking about earlier. Has many relationships aren't live. So if you have like a handlebars template and you're outputting each comment on a blog, and then you add a new comment, it won't appear in the template automatically because the relationship doesn't update properly. That will hopefully be fixed soon. You can use store.filter in the meantime as a workaround. Invalid JSON. If you accidentally return an empty string from your API, it will silently fail because that is not valid JSON. If you have done the RSVP on error, that will show it up for you. This sometimes just leaves me like cursing for ages because you'll see 200 OK in your network log on Chrome, but it just won't work and you won't know why. Find and find with curlies is different. If you do find posts, store.find posts, it will return you a live array. If you do store.find posts with curlies, the result is not live. It will only give you what's in the actual query returned. So, in-memory caching issues. Sometimes Ember Data caches too much, too aggressively. Post-reload is relatively new, but if you're not sure if you have the record loaded from the beginning, then you might have to do a workaround like this. Debugging. Always use the debugger. Learn to use the debugger. If you don't know how to use the debugger, go and take an hour now and learn how to use it. It will save you so many hours. You can use console.log and log in the templates that was mentioned earlier, and the transition logging, and there's a great blog post here about debugging. Architecture. So this is, I'm sure you all know, an outline of the architecture. If you can work with this, it will make your life so much easier. Trying to break this and trying to manipulate views from roots or whatever is just going to cause you pain. In JavaScript, some things aren't real objects. Strings aren't real objects, even though they kind of behave like them. If you are using strings as like your models or putting them in your templates, this can be really confusing. Ember object self-troll. Go and read this blog post. It shows how when you're defining objects, you can sometimes have really unintended consequences if you use non-primitives in your ember.object.extend calls. Function scope and this in JavaScript. This is something that's just really confusing about JavaScript, and if you're ever confused why this is window, it's because you haven't scoped your function and you need to use a closure or use one of Ember's built-ins where you can provide a context. Don't use .push with Ember arrays because it won't update. This is something that still catches me all the time because the array is updated in the console or whatever, but it's not updating the templates. Push does not notify observers that Ember needs to update things. If you're using CoffeeScript, the top action is incorrect 50% of the time because returning true from an action handler causes the action to bubble, and toggle property returns true 50% of the time. In actions in CoffeeScript, always remember to put return. When you're using CoffeeScript, use the long way of defining computed properties because it's actually shorter. em.computed is much nicer because of the argument order. You don't have to wrap it in parentheses. And finally, mistakes asking for help. If you're asking for help on the internet, I'm always in Emberjs on ILC. I don't sleep. I'm there all the time, so, ping me. Then, there are some classic mistakes to asking questions, like asking too broadly. Like someone will ask, how do I remove the skin from my cat? Be like, well, I don't know. You need to get a really sharp knife. Why? What's actually the problem? Well, my cat's a bit ill. That's not the problem that you want to solve. You should really ask, how do I make my cat not ill? Because then people will give you good advice rather than telling you how to skin your cat. Always give a reproducible example. Preferably, gist is good. Show some code. The smaller the amount of accurate context you can give, the better. But if you can give a working example in JSBin or JS Fiddle that actually works, is minimal code and shows the problem, I guarantee you will get an answer far quicker than any other way. It's the most efficient way to solve your problems. No one's going to show you how to do it wrong. So if you come and ask, questions, and even if I know how to, arbitrarily render ember.views and insert them into places outside of your Ember application, for example, I've done that. I'm not going to tell you how to do it because I think it's wrong. So unless you can convince me that what you're doing is legit, or convince whoever's helping you, I'm probably going to steer you towards what I think is correct. I may be wrong, but at the end of the day, I want to give good advice, not bad advice, and that includes not telling you to do the wrong thing. And finally, if you don't understand and you've asked for help, say that you don't understand, because people will always be willing to explain in more detail. But if you just don't say that what part you don't understand, it's really hard to figure out how to help you. Thank you very much.